Tell me a little bit about yourself.
I'm currently a solicitor in residential property.
This is Millie. We're sitting in the impressive kitchen of her old stone house. She's in her 30s, she's smartly dressed, she's got shoulder-length brown hair. Describing somebody as sensible feels like a bit of a backhanded compliment, and yet she really is. But what she's about to tell me is, well, no spoilers, but it's extreme. So this is the story of a haunted house.
Yes.
And it's the house that you grew up in.
Mm-hmm. Yep, between the ages of 12 and 17.
The house lies about 12 miles from where we're sat now. We're not going to name it as somebody else is living there now, but let's just say it's very old and very remote.
We were a mile out of the village and half a mile off the main road. It was built in 1667.
To built the year after the Great Fire of London and the plague.
Yes, it was quite a historical property, a farmhouse. My grandparents bought it as a shell and renovated it, and it was my father's childhood home.
When Millie says father, she's talking about her stepdad, Robert. Her first experience of the house comes just after he marries her mum. So it's the 1990s and Millie is 6.
After the ceremony, I was put down for a nap in my father's childhood bedroom, and I felt very uncomfortable, but couldn't explain it. I'm lying in bed and I don't like it. I don't want to be on my own, but I don't know why.
Time passes, Millie forgets, but then 6 years later, Millie finds herself moving into the house.
So my paternal grandmother was diagnosed with cancer. We agreed to move in so we could be there to help look after her.
The bedroom she's given is that same one, her stepdad's old room.
I remember it so clearly. Everywhere around the house, I'd feel like I was being watched. The room under my bedroom, the hall, I'd feel there was a presence in one particular corner. And when my sister and I were playing outside, I'd feel someone was watching me from the windows in the attic.
The attic is the part of the house that scares Millie most.
Every so often my mum would say, "Can you go up to the loft and get such and such?" And I would cry with fear.
So what did you expect to find up there?
A person. That's the overwhelming feeling, that there was someone else in this house.
So, up until this point, is it fair to say that this is all feelings? You haven't actually seen or heard anything?
No.
Does that change?
Yes. So about the age of 14, things started to become more physical. Things started to move during the night. I would hear a rolling across the floorboards in my bedroom. And I'd turn the light on and there'd be nothing in the middle of the floor. I'd turn the light off and the noise would start again. Every night. Sometimes at night, to try and disguise the fear, I would listen to music.
Is this the glorious days of the CD Walkman?
This is indeed, yes. Then, when I was ready to go to sleep, I'd take the earphones out, put it down on the floor, go to sleep. And in the morning, the earbuds would have gone. And
So the little foamy bits on the end of the headphones?
the whole earpiece, they were cut off at the wire.
What?
Yeah. The whole in-ear plastic bit would be gone. Happened about 5 or 6 times.
It's almost like somebody doesn't want you to listen to that music. Mm-hmm. Does it get worse?
Yes. So, spring 2000, studying for my GCSEs. I remember it really clearly, the day it really kicked off. Sitting on my bed, reading my maths textbook, and I hear, just inside the door is a pile of lever arch files that have spent months sitting on top of my bookcase, and they're now in a pile 17 foot away. And then a few minutes later, I started hearing little plastic taps. And I look at my stereo and a pile of cassette tapes on top of one of the speakers are moving one at a time off the speaker onto the floor and restacking. Stereo's not on. There was no sound coming from it, but they're moving in a straight line horizontally and then straight down vertically into a pile on the floor.
Falling.
Yeah, but like someone's picked one up and is putting it down slowly. They are being moved off the speaker. And then I just ran. I went to the kitchen and I explained what I'd seen, and Mum looked at me and said, "We've got a poltergeist."
It's time to involve some experts. This episode, I'm joined by one of the UK's best-known skeptics, psychologist Chris French, and somebody who'll be familiar to any Battersea Poltergeist listeners, parapsychologist Evelyn Hollow. Chris, let's start with you. Can a house be haunted?
Well, personally, I don't believe in ghosts, so I'd have to say no. But I would acknowledge that certain houses are much spookier than others. And it sounds like Millie may well have been living in a very spooky house. I mean, Millie reported that her mum had just married who was to become a stepfather. And although it was a kind of very happy relationship, that would have been a very, very emotionally charged day in lots of ways. And then she's there in this house with its old history, its spooky dark corners. And I can understand why a 6-year-old may well have felt uncomfortable in that situation. But once that seed's been planted, then it very often will grow. All kinds of very mundane events will then be interpreted within that context, and it becomes a kind of feedback cycle where, you know, people can get really, really terrified.
Evelyn, what are your thoughts on this?
I absolutely do believe houses can be haunted. In cases like this that we would categorise as poltergeist cases, we often find that because there's such a high level of activity and phenomena, it usually links to something that has happened in that place that's quite traumatic or quite strong. There's something called stone tape theory, the idea that emotional or traumatic events are recorded onto things like items, i.e. like houses, which are replayed under certain conditions. We are looking at this from the perspective that the house itself is behaving like a cassette tape.
Interesting. We should say, I think, that stone tape theory is very controversial. It's something that really divides skeptics and believers. But Chris, Evelyn's described this as a poltergeist case. It's the word that Millie's mum uses too. The first example of that is these strange rolling noises that Millie hears at night. What was your take on that?
What it made me think of, there was a story in the media about a year ago of a chap who had a little workshop in his garden. It was very messy, he'd leave stuff around, but when he came in the next morning, everything had been tidied up. And he decided, with the help of a neighbour, to video what was going on to get to the bottom of it. It turned out it was a little house-proud mouse. And it's just an explanation that no one would have thought of for moving objects.
That's great. Evelyn, mice.
Well, mice can be responsible for some of the noises, but in terms of the headphones, she's saying they're not chewed, they're cut. And also, mice doing it once, yes, but mice doing it every single time?
And unless they're the kind of mice that appear in Disney films, Chris, they couldn't be responsible for moving cassette tapes off a speaker and restacking them neatly on the floor.
The cassettes is a much weirder claim. It may be that what she saw there was a hallucination, and people are much more likely to hallucinate when they're very stressed. We know that she was studying for her exams at this point. She was feeling very, very stressed.
Evelyn, you're not quite convinced.
I definitely can't categorise that as a hallucination. This is something that has lasted more than a few seconds. This is very deliberately and slowly having an object lift horizontally and then lower down and then stack themselves in a uniform pattern. That shows intention, agenda, consciousness.
Thanks, both of you. Really interesting. I think it's time to meet our next witness, because that genteel house that I've been sitting in with Millie is not hers. It's her parents. And they are sitting in the living room next door. So let's hear from Millie's mum, Mary.
From the moment I moved in, I just felt terribly uneasy, but I couldn't put my finger on it, so we just tried to live with it.
So you'd felt very uncomfortable about this house for a long time?
Yes, because it was my in-laws' property and we used to go and visit. I always felt I was being watched. My in-laws admitted that, yes, they called it a poltergeist, and they said it was always playing tricks.
So things are out in the open now. Millie and her mum are acknowledging that they both believe the house is haunted. But is the house also acknowledging them?
So, whilst Mum and I are discussing our experiences, we hear a smack from the far end of the house, and we get up and race down, and we enter the hall, the room I don't like, being in after dark, and a very large gilt-framed mirror that was resting on the floor against a wall behind a 3-foot-tall stereo cabinet had risen up and over the top and smashed against the far wall.
The mirror was so heavy I couldn't lift it, so some unnatural force had come in and lifted this whole thing and thrown it across the room. And my builder at the time said, "That'll teach you for being rude about the presence in the house," because he said she heard you. And it just shook us all.
I've just popped out into the garden. So did you spot that the builder said she heard you? Remember that, because later on we're going to get deeper into theories that local people had about what or who is haunting the house. But first, I just want to play you something that I recorded when Millie was out the room. So this is a story that Mary told me about an experience that she had had in the house. And I can see that it still left her shaken. So it takes place in the kitchen, and it begins when she smells something bad.
It was absolutely invasive and vile, sort of rotting flesh meets sewage. And I thought, oh my God, we've got a mouse or something has died under the fridge. So I pulled the fridge out, swept it all around, there was absolutely nothing there, pushed the fridge back, stood at the sink, and I just felt that something was getting far too close to me, and I backed into the corner, and Robert came out and he said, "Are you all right?" And I was shaking my head and I couldn't speak. It sounds very dramatic, but I felt that if I spoke, it wouldn't be my voice coming out. This sounds very far-fetched, I'm very sorry. It was as if it was standing, as I felt, behind me, and it walked forwards, and it came into my body that way. I felt just invaded by this wretched thing.
So what do you feel is in the kitchen with you?
Something menacing, something not very pleasant at all.
I don't know about you, but I got a real chill down my spine there when Mary said that she knew that if she opened her mouth, it wouldn't be her voice coming out. With the mirror incident and this, it feels like things are building now. And for Millie, the atmosphere in the house becomes really oppressive.
In my room, I'd hear someone walking along the corridor, and after hearing it, I'd think, that was footsteps on wood and our landing's carpeted. There's a 7-year age gap between my sister and I, and as I got into my teens, I would babysit, and being the only two at home and hearing squeaking on the stairs as if someone was walking up, that wasn't pleasant.
At the high point of all that activity, how scared were you?
Terrified. I just can't put into words accurately how scary it is to know there's a presence in your house that you can't see. We would dread going home.
When we talk about hauntings, we find ourselves arguing about if the things described actually happened. And it's easy to forget that whether you think the events are supernatural or the figments of somebody's imagination, the impact of the fear they feel is the same. It's real. It's life-changingly real. And it can push them to the very edge. So, a warning, the next section is going to be incredibly disturbing. What impact do you think it has on you?
It affected me for a long time. my confidence, my self-esteem. I fell into a huge depression. One day, it was evening, and I was just in my room watching TV and feeling very, very sad. And then I sort of blacked out and came to trying to hang myself from a beam in my bedroom. There was a beam across the centre of the room, and I was sort of stood on this stool. There was a rope. I didn't know how I'd got there, but I was almost ready to step off and hang myself.
So you literally came to standing on the stool with the noose around your neck?
Yeah. It was pretty scary. I just went, why am I here? And got down.
So whatever this thing was in the house, you felt it had led you to this point?
I felt like I was placed there. It's like someone else had taken over my actions.
It's very brave for you to talk about this, and to articulate it. There will be people listening who believe that you had a time when you were struggling with mental illness.
Mm-hmm.
You have this very, very strong belief that it was because of what was going on in the house. This is a very personal question, but did you have any therapy for how you were feeling?
I've been through counselling.
Did you feel nervous going into a therapy session and telling somebody what you felt was the cause of what happened?
I would assess what they were like and how the sessions were going before I would admit that I'd grown up in a haunted house. Some of them would just go, right, and brush it off.
From a skeptic perspective, some people will look at this and they'll say, your first experience of this house right at the very beginning is this uncertain time for you, your mother getting married. And then you move into another sad time, your grandmother dying. And you go through some very stressful times here, your teenage years, your exams. Is it possible that you projected your inward feelings onto the house and the house became a canvas for how you felt inside?
I am very happy to accept that not everyone's going to believe me. I'm open to any other suggestions or someone proving me wrong if they're able to explain how cassette tapes moved off a stereo one at a time. That's fine.
I feel for Millie, and I think it's incredibly brave of her to talk about this experience. I want to know how her mum, Mary, feels about it in light of her own experiences in the house. How did you feel, Mary, when Millie told you that she had tried to hang herself?
Well, it was a heck of a shock.
She feels that it's the house that made her do that. You had that moment where you felt like this thing took over you for a moment. Like it, I guess we could say possessed you.
Yeah.
Do you think it's possible that happened to Millie too?
Yes, I suppose it could. We've never discussed that. But yes, if this thing could go through me, then I don't see why it would not affect Millie.
I'm back with Chris and Evelyn. Huge dramatic developments there. This is horribly shocking, isn't it, Evelyn?
Absolutely, it's incredibly traumatic. I mean, suicide is a grim and harrowing enough thing to even contemplate in and of itself, but to not do it consciously, for it not to be her choice, that's not suicide, that's attempted murder, essentially.
Chris, how did you react to that moment?
It's absolutely horrible. I mean, my heart goes out to Millie for having had that experience. If the account as given by Millie is accurate, then that does indicate that Millie at times could do stuff without realising she was doing it. If indeed Millie does have this potential to, for whatever reason, go into some kind of dissociative state where she's carrying out actions that she subsequently has no memory of, is it possible that some of the other apparently inexplicable events that took place, objects moving from one location to another, the whole host of things that she'd reported as happening, might she have been responsible for those things herself and now have no memory of them? And then, the other possibility is that did this really happen at all? Or maybe, even though she sincerely believes it happened, might it be a false memory? And Millie's description does have a certain kind of dreamlike quality to me. Maybe it was something she actually dreamt, and she's now remembering it as having been a real thing that happened. Whatever the explanation is, it's understandably very scary and very, very unpleasant.
Evelyn, dissociative behaviour, that ability to almost compartmentalise the brain so that, I guess in the simplest terms, the right hand doesn't know what the left hand is doing. That could explain all of this, couldn't it?
Well, my initial reaction is that would explain, objects being moved and not remembering them, but it doesn't explain so much else of this case, and it doesn't explain the fact that she's not the only one that experiences it. And even much larger before that, these things have been happening before Millie even lives there, because the grandparents have already experienced it. That to me suggests that there is an external force happening independent of Millie. It just happens to be focused on her.
There's one person we haven't spoken about much yet, a person who is key to this story. He is the reason that both Mary and Millie are in this house. I think it's about time I seek out Millie's stepdad. Robert, did you live in a haunted house? I mean, Millie and Mary are both very convinced it was haunted. And I mean, indeed, both of them have had quite traumatic experiences in their own way there.
Right. Okay. I didn't ever have any extraordinary experience that I can remember. Now, my folks reckoned that there was a presence of sorts, which they thought was benign.
Had you told Mary about them?
Whether I had said something, or perhaps my folks had said something.
This house was passed down through the generations. I wonder if this fear of something in the house was passed down as well.
The thing is, I didn't look on if there were something. But okay, accepting that there might be, I didn't look on it as being malevolent. I considered it to be benign.
I could see that Robert is finding this difficult. He feels very differently to Millie and Mary about the house. And it strikes me that houses are like mirrors. They reflect back how we are feeling.
The house was very special to me, and so it was heart-wrenching to leave it.
But Mary said to you that she had to leave.
Yes.
So in a way, Millie and Mary felt haunted by the house.
Yeah.
And you felt haunted by having to leave it.
Yeah, there we are.
A ghost that passes on through the generations. You can really look at that in two ways, can't you? Is this house that's being handed down literally haunted? Or is it simply the belief that is passed down? Belief that in some people becomes fear. There's a final piece of evidence that we need to throw into the mix. The history of the house. Had something dramatic happened there in the past? I'm going to let Millie tell this.
So someone in the village did some research and they discovered that in the 18th century, I think it was 1700s, a young girl had hung herself in the house. We're not sure why. We theorised she may have fallen pregnant out of wedlock. And I think it was the ghost showing me what she'd been through and why she was there. And I was at the right age for it to draw on my energy. And it was just having a young girl as the ghost felt like the right explanation.
Just one more detail that might be relevant. Where the local historians thought this tragic act had taken place.
We think it was done in the attic.
What is going on in this intriguing, complicated case? Is it the story of two teenage girls separated across centuries, one reaching out to the other? Or is it the story of a family feeding each other's fear and accidentally inventing a ghost? I want to know